So we'll just get these legs blocked in with some of their white, and then go and work on the top part of the aisle. Get that top part of the wing done, the wing blocked in. I just like to get a little bit more of the lighting effect going down on the bottom half first. And I really like this little tool here for blending on pastel mat. Helps me really soften edges too. So now just looking for where the light's catching on the legs. Try looking at the overall shape. Try and find those bigger areas to block in first. And I'll worry about the ends of the legs and the feet a bit later. So just blocking in some of the brightest areas. And once you've got some of these shadow colors in, it's really nice to just go around and start picking out some of those really bright highlighted edges. Really not being too fussy at this stage though. My marks are quite rough. Just trying to get it at least to the point that when I stand back and have a look at it in the mirror, the overall form of it will start to look right. So this area down the front still needs a lot of work, but I'd like to get on now and have a better look at this wing. And this top line of the wing is really catching the light. And then I'm just going to use this brown earth to start and find the outline of the rest of the bird. Of course, I've got pattern to add to these parts, but I've just picked a sort of mid-tone brown earth that I can see within the pattern, and start to pick out some parts of the outer line of the wings. And you can see how untidy that is. It's a bit awkward from this angle when I'm filming. So if you can get yourself angled better than I am for filming purposes, you should be able to make all the sorts of sweeping edges and lines that you need. Don't be afraid to turn the painting around. If you need better access to make a certain type of mark, so lots of really nice brown earth tones in a barn owl, and hopefully I'll be able to have some more time to focus on these lovely patterns. I think I'll be making use of the pastel pencils quite a bit for those parts. But you can really even use these blenders just to shape things using the background pigment that you've already got down. You don't even have to apply more pastel to the paper at this point in some areas. And again, another nice bright white edge being caught by the light. And you can see that anytime I want a real strength in the color of the pigment, I'm really making use of the smaller pieces of soft pastel. They really give me the best strength of color. But of course, you can only be so precise with the bigger sticks. So for little edges like this, you can see just how much easier it is than with the pastel pencil. So start looking for some of the shadows around the edge of this wing. Really like how the edge of this wing meets that dark shadow underneath. Trying to get as close to the shape of it as possible using the bigger stick. So I hope that if you're working along, you're enjoying this, because it's not the easiest of challenges. Don't be worried if you're finding this really difficult. I'm finding it difficult too. It's new for me. And more than when I paint other subject matters that I've painted many times. I've really got to think about this. I've got to really look at what I'm seeing. And that's sometimes why I like to draw freehand when I'm doing my wildlife pieces, because they're not animals, unlike dogs and cats, they're not animals that we get to see all the time. So that extra bit of study time for me always comes in useful when I come to paint the animal or the bird. That's one of the reasons I really like painting wildlife so much. We don't often have the privilege to sit and really study these animals up close. So just that little shadowed edge down the edge of the wing, that's what I'm really trying for at the moment. And again, those wings with their patterns do look quite complicated, but I'm hoping when I get to that stage it won't be quite so bad. So again, just bringing some more reflected shadow light in the dark area. Trying to make it at its absolute darkest right in at the crease where it meets the wing. Just looking at this top edge of the wing. Even at this stage, still making some little adjustments or corrections to the drawing stage. So now that I've got some of the wings in, I can just start to see the contrast between this area being the brightest white and then a slightly darker cream here. So the more areas you get in, the more you should be able to compare them against each other and then make little adjustments. Brightening that area as it comes around this side of the head. Maybe even a little just up here. So at this stage, pretty well on. I just want to get the rest of this wing blocked in. And also the tail feathers blocked in. And then I can start a little bit of the refining process and really show you how I would go back through all of what I've done and start to really add some detail to the feathers. So in this shorter demo, I'll be limited as to what detail I have. But in this shorter demo, I'll be quite limited as to what time I have to add extra details. So I'm going to try and keep it as loose as possible. So just starting to gradient that colour down, ignoring all of the pattern of course, but looking for some of the bigger shapes within that. And really just trying to block in the base colours. And I just give that all a light blend into the paper. Already it starts to add some of the nice glowing colours that we need on the wings. And I'm hoping that at the end it will just be a matter of using some pastel pencil and some small pieces of my soft pastels to dot some of the pattern over the top of this. That seems like the logical way to go about this, to build up the tones first. And then try to add the pattern over the top. That's what I'm going to try anyway. And of course there is a lovely clean edge between the white and where that colour starts, so I can just use my white again to make that edge nice and crisp. And then just lightly dragging the white down from the top here into my yellow brown earth colours. You can start to gradient that in from bright white at the very top of the wing, and then it just fades out as it curves down. So it's much easier to paint the wing when you're ignoring all of the pattern, and that's just what I'm focusing on, getting this base coat. And again, thinking roughly of the direction of the feathers, making my marks sweep around like that. So I'll come back to this wing and start to add more detail, but for now I want to also finish off blocking in on the tail feathers. So just coming in with the darks first. Looking for those creases down the feathers. And as well as my unisons, I also make use of some of these Terry Ludwigs, an American brand. If you don't have the exact same colours as me, that's absolutely fine to substitute for something similar. So just looking for the way this tail feather bends around, and that nice little strip of pattern that runs off. And again, if I make a bit of a slip like here, it's quite easy to come back in with my white. And just start to strengthen that line again. It's not helpful when you put a really dark colour in the wrong place, where you want a nice crisp white highlight. That's why I tend to come in quite early with some of my highlight colours, just so that I don't have a really dark colour to cover. And then these teal feathers here, although they're quite light because they're being hit by the light, I do still need to add some darker marks, especially over towards this side. So I just want to remember that my shadow line should curve around here. And of course this area in here really is the darkest, apart from perhaps the black within the eyes. So I'm not coming in with pure black, using a mixture of the dark navy and this very dark brown, which I've used also in the background, so I want to make use of it in here as well. So now I'm about ready to come in with some of the lighter colours, just to pick out some of the sunlit areas. And of course around the very edges of the feathers isn't a hard line like in my drawing. I've got to think about those feathered edges. And really look at the direction that these marks fan out. And I can neaten the very edges of it afterwards, but I'll just try and get it blocked in like this. So this is where it really helps when your background overlaps your line drawing of the main subject. These softer edges are very easy to create when you don't have a gap between your background and your main subject. And once I get to this point, we're sort of in the shadows over here, so I don't want to use the same tonal value over here, although I am going to bring the value of this side up a little more. But of course not quite as bright as white. When you compare this area to some of the brightest parts in the bird, it really is nowhere near as bright. Picking out a few extra highlights down that. Then I can use one of my little tools just to help around the edges. Just dragging some of the background colour in between the feathers. So just trying to loosely shape some of these feathers. Tricky with the bigger sticks, but I don't have to be too precise about it. So I'm just looking for the overall shape that this area makes. Trying to take my time here, aim the pastel nicely and get some fine edges. You can see how well the colour goes on top of dark though. It's not a problem to get lighter colours on top of your dark layers. And then of course I can make use of the pastel pencil to try and neaten this up a little. So just having a look at the shape of this shadow again, I'm always able to come back in and just amend that slightly, get the curve of it better. And also just darken down over here a little bit again. Starting to lose the contrast there for my lighter marks. And you want to start to get a little bit of that crisscross idea going on. And just below this then, at this corner, just a little bit of light catching here where the feathers are meeting. So all of these areas are really areas I could spend a very long time working on each individual part. But I'm just trying to get the overall effect a little quicker. Don't forget, if you're working along, you can always pause the video. Really take your time on it. If you want to go into further detail. I think part of the problem with this part of the teal feather is that it's very dark here, and I made the background here also quite dark. So I'm going to quickly add a little bit of lighter color into the background here, and I think it's going to help the teal feather stand out. So that's something that I'm always doing with my backgrounds, trying to get each part of the background to contrast really nicely, make that part of the subject really pop out from the page. So it's very easy just to add a little bit of light color in there. hopefully now this bottom line of the bird will show up a little better. So we're almost there with the blocking in stage, and we'll be on to building up a little bit more detail and definition right across the bird next. So yeah, I really think that helps, just having that little bit of light colour in there. And then, for example, to contrast that, I've got a good dark colour in here, which sets off that white edge of the owl really well. Lots of dark colours up this side of the owl just to set that off. So that's something to think about when you're working on backgrounds. How does it help the main subject? So just some little bits of light catching in here. So yeah, really not going to worry too much more about any detail in the tail feathers. It's something I can come back to if I have time at the end. But more importantly, I want to start getting some more of the texture on the rest of the bird. Okay, so this already starts to look very 3D. What I'm going to do now is just refine the feathers on the front, work a little bit more on the shadow areas, really show you how I come in then with the pastel pencils and start to refine the areas that I've created and soften. And I'll also just very quickly block in these feet, or the front of the legs. Then once I've done that, I'll get on to creating the main bits of pattern that we can see down the wings and on the top of the head, and that should be it. So with the pastel pencil, of course, you can come back in around the edges of things, just creating some of the smaller flyaway hairs. And then really in the photo reference, I may well crop a bit more of these feet off because there isn't that much of them on show in the photo reference. So I haven't really decided what to do with those yet. But I'll really just try and hint at how the light is hitting them, just like everything else. Putting some of my blue violet tones down one side. So really not too concerned with it, just get them blocked in for now. And I decided to exclude the little pieces of leather around the feet, so that's why I can't really see what's going on in this area. This is something that later on I would go and look at some other photo references of barn aisles and just see exactly what's going on down that part of the feet. But for now I'm just happy enough to get them blocked in and not worry too much about it. So in these areas up the front of the chest, that's really where I want to focus on now, just softening the blunt edges of some of those shadows. Some of the shadows do need quite a harsh edge to it, so like the one under the chin here, but then the bottom part of this highlighted area sort of fades down into the shadow down below. So it's just going along looking for the little places where I can refine what I've done. But I'm quite happy with a lot of the texture already, just from how the soft pastel goes onto the pastel matte paper. I'm quite happy with how the texture of this area already looks quite feathery before I even get any of the pattern on there. So just working with the texture of the paper. Just starting to soften some of these little shadow areas. They're not solid shadow, you can see some texture through them. And just some of those little soft edges are going to add that feathered look as well. Just softening it in each time. So you really could spend a long time going around. This is how you get closer and closer to really photorealistic sort of results. But there are many areas that you can be a little more suggestive with. And you really don't have to continue a painting on until the photorealism level. There are many stages at which you could stop before that. So it really is up to the individual artist when you call a painting finished. Just really depends on what you're trying to achieve as an artist. Just a little patch over here that catches the light. again, like before, you can come in with a blender just to help shape things, soften the edges. Even to darken down a little bit like I'm doing here. So just seeing if I can find a little bit more detail within the shadows. It's surprising how little work you can do to shadow areas, because our eyes do naturally see a bit less detail in there. So just getting some of those glowing colours in there can be enough. And that's pretty much how I would continue with the pastel pencils if I wanted to get this all to a really high level of detail. Just continuing to refine these areas. But even as it is, I think I can pretty much call this front area done. And now I'm on to the important job of adding all the little speckles, so they're right over the whole bird, so in the darkest areas, also in the brightest areas. So what I'm going to try and do for that is to use a couple of different coloured pastel pencils, some to describe those darkest spots that are in the shadows, and I'll probably use some black for the very darkest spots like in here. But then for the areas that are in the sunlight, I'm probably going to use a lighter grey, even perhaps some will be brown coloured as they come up into the warm areas of the bird. So don't try and create a speckled effect with just one colour all over. Even the speckles themselves are within light and shade, and you need to think about that a little bit. So we're just using a very sharp pastel pencil, not leaning too heavily. And then as well coming back in and just, rather than rubbing them, it's more like giving them a soft press into the paper. So it just knocks them back a little bit, sinks them into the other pigments so that they're not quite so obvious. So just sort of tapping them back into the paper a little bit. So just picking up a brown now. Not quite as dark here as it is in here. And with something like this, I mean, you don't have to get absolutely every speckle in exactly the right place. But there's no harm in trying, because the natural flow and pattern of it, I mean, I'm not going to improve upon that, so I may as well use what I can see in the photo reference and attempt to get them in similar places, or at least get the the coverage of them pretty similar, so similar number of spots, what would be common on this bird, so you don't want to stray too far from the photo reference. But it's really quite simple to get darker marks to go on top of your other layers using the pencils. And of course I'm trying not to lean my hand on any of the work that I've already done. And just as it comes in around this area on the chest, I think we're quite dark in here again. Just add a few of these now with the black. So anywhere that I can avoid using the black, I will, because the other colours are going to add a bit more interest to it, maybe some warmth. Black can be very stark, so a bit like with white, sometimes I do try to limit my use of it, using other colours over the top of black, browns or deep blues, purples. So many ways that you can tint the black tones in your painting. So some aren't quite as strong as others, just try and create a little variation between them. The dots, many of them are different sizes. It's not like uniform polka dots all over, so don't get into the rhythm of making exactly the same mark and then just do it all over. Really try and vary your marks. And then as well as that, some of them you can rub into the paper more than others. So the ones that are out here in the sunlight, just because they're going on top of all that light coloured pigment, we will see a difference in the colour of these using the brown. It's going to mix slightly with the light colour underneath. And also just looking at the little marks out here, I can almost see like a little cross shape on each one, like a little diamond. Just when you see them in the lit areas, you can see that they do have not quite a circular shape to them. And just like in the shadows, some are a little darker than others, So yeah, just trying to follow what I'm seeing in the photo reference. But yeah, each one going on with a little bit of care. And because I'm making like tiny little cross shapes, I'm also trying to follow that flow of the feathers and of the muscle underneath here. And as I take these speckles into the dark in here, they should become much darker. So just like the flow of the feathers, how it continues into the shadow areas, so do these speckles, and the only thing really that changes is the color. So we come on up around the side of the head now. And back onto the brown for where it's in the sunlight. And that's always the danger of having just worked in a dark area and then coming back into your bright area and smudging on some dark pigment, but it's never the end of the world. So the main reason I'm adding these speckles at the end, which I'm sure you can see by now, is it allows me to really work on the overall form and the shapes on the body. It wouldn't be easy to start and adjust that now that I've got these speckles on, as you're adding colour in between all of these dots. So I may pick up a slightly lighter brown and add a few little marks just as they're coming down from the head here. So even these speckles in some way describe the form of the bird. Just how they curve down from the head. It doesn't seem to be any particular pattern, so I'm just going for individual dots here and there and little clumps of them that I can see in the photo reference, hoping that the overall effect of them will be enough. I'm going to add a few grey toned ones as well in between, just different little speckles. Not every speckle is the same colour or the same strength of colour. So it's starting to look a little bit more barn owl-esque. They really need their markings. He looked very naked without them. And we're almost done with the simple speckled areas. Now it's mainly just the top of this head area and this area of wing, but I think that looks pretty good with the speckles so far. Once I've got all of the speckles in, I'll be able to go over them a little bit and look for where they should be maybe a bit darker. So there is certainly a very interesting pattern going on the barn owl. And rather than try to get every single little piece in the right place, especially on the top of the head here, where it's really going back off into the distance, and we can afford to go into less detail here than on the wing where it's facing us more. So just adding in a few lighter flecks of colour for me to add my brown dots on top of. As always, trying to see some of the background colours, seeing that the brown dots are actually on top of lighter dots. It's going to be hopefully a bit easier on the wings where there's a little bit more space, but I will try and get a hint of that effect here. And of course the markings should look hopefully like they're disappearing back off the top of the head. I'm just using the brown now to try and pick out the little rows of darker dots. So the main thing that I'm really looking for on the head is the overall tone right across it. Seems to have a sort of blue tone to parts of it. Coming right over in between the speckles. And then we're really left with the orange sections at the front. So if you're working on this along with me and you've chosen to go on a slightly bigger scale, you're going to find this part much more easy. On this scale there's really only so much I can do. And I could spend a long time with the pastel pencils on these areas. But really just trying to get some sense of the way the marks flow back. And again, just with a slightly lighter brown maybe for some of the ones right around the front. Well, then I can just use the pastel pencils to come in and try and accentuate some parts of this. Also just starting to like scumble in some of the grey pastel pencil in between the dots. So yeah, it really is quite fiddly on this scale. So there won't be a huge amount more that I do to the top of the head. Hope to get a bit more detail on the wing areas. So over on this other wing, we'll try and get a little bit of detail in the pattern on this. Of course, because this is the first time I've painted any owl, but a barn owl in particular, I really am not sure about the process, so this is a bit of an experiment for me too. I think next time I would probably want to paint an owl a bit bigger than this, just to give full space for all the detail that I'd like to be able to get on the feathers. So now just starting to block in, using the pencil here, all the shapes on the wing. Block in those darker areas. And because I've already got some soft pastel on the paper, it's very easy just to come along with the pastel pencil and darken these areas down. Just using the pencil because it gives me a more precise edge to work with, just when I'm in particular trying to sketch this out, trying to see how this line comes down the edge of the feathers. So I can still let some of that nice brown earth and those orange tones shine through. And just to very lightly give myself an outline for this unusual patch of pattern that just fills this area. And then of course we've got lots of little speckles at the top, taking my lighter brown for these. So this part is quite time consuming. Just take your time with it. Try to make those marks look natural. Don't let your dots become too uniformed. Make sure that you make them much lighter on the areas where it's brighter. And that's really the key to anything speckled. That same way of thinking will help you with freckles and human portraits. And of course you can start to shape around some of the dots, just the way you can see that a lot of them are sort of outlined with a little rim of white. So just searching for any prominent shapes of colour. This point that comes down and meets this other feather. So there are these very unusual shaped little, almost like eyes, dotted throughout this pattern, and I'm just going to dot in some of the little light areas to mark where those might go. And I really would be here all day if I tried to do each of these little parts of the pattern to a very high standard. So I'm going to try and do them a little bit more suggestively. But you can spend longer on this if you wish. Try and see how much detail you can get on the pattern. Just looking at where all the little flecks are. And they really are almost like little eyes. So I'm just getting an idea of how those spread out. Perhaps use the brown for over on this side where it's getting lighter. And of course, if you're spending lots of time, you could come in around it with your blenders. Starting now as well, just to look for some of that sort of quilted pattern that we see around these shapes. Really darkening down this area. And all the time try and get some distance from your work. If you're unsure about the effect that you're creating, the best way to judge it is by standing back. Have a look at it in the mirror. Look at it from different angles, turn it upside down. Take a photograph of it so that you can see it small on your phone. All of this helps when you're trying to judge what's wrong. So really just using a little scumbling technique to get the texture in. And then of course in between all of these black areas that I've created, it's not really the orange that we can see. So I want to try and dabble in some of this blue violet that I've been using all along. And pretty much the tiniest dots that I can make. Really trying to figure out how to create that pattern from a distance at least. So just really darkening down this back part of the wing, ready to take some highlight colours. So it's a pretty rough way to try and get the texture on the wings. Definitely if I was working on a larger scale, I could try and get a little bit more detail. But it's still possible to come back in and work on each little piece. You can see how just with the pencils I can come back in and strengthen some of this. So yeah, this part is definitely the trickiest part of the whole piece. I'd really like to have a go at one of these wings just on a larger scale and really study what's going on with this pattern. But I feel like if I sat with it for long enough here, I would get it to a pretty realistic place. So we're not too far off the end with this. And I hope that the main thing you gain from this is how to approach painting sunlight, as that's the main thing that I want you to experiment with a painting like this. I mentioned earlier that I chose this photo reference mainly because of the lovely direction of light, how it cast lots of shadows across the white bird. And that's what I'm always advising anyone who's just beginning. When you're choosing photo reference, try and choose something with really pronounced lighting in it, so where you can see really good crisp shadows. The more subtle or the more neutral the lighting is, sometimes that's even harder to see your color values. When you can see a big area of contrast between light and shade, it definitely makes it easier in the beginning to start seeing those extra colors. So this top ridge here, just looking for how those little eye shapes come around and describe the form up there. So that's the first thing I'm adding. And again, scumbling some of that nice blue violet on. You don't have to worry about the edges, you can still neaten those up. So yeah, definitely lots more work that I can do just to neaten up my pattern on the wings, but that is pretty much the full build-up of the piece. So I hope that you enjoyed either watching or creating this little owl along with me, and I hope this tutorial can show you what you can do with soft pastel in just a few hours. You don't have to go into huge amounts of detail to get something that looks very realistic. If you've enjoyed this, then please do subscribe to me here on YouTube. I release lots of free content here on my channel. Also, if you'd like to see my full list of real-time tutorials, check me out over on Patreon. I'll leave lots of useful links in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, happy pasteling.